Hello again and welcome to the Gospel of Luke. I can hardly believe that we're in our 25th of 26 programs on this Gospel. We're back again with two guests who will help us conclude our study of this fantastic Gospel that we've been with all year with you. Our first guest, as always, is Dr. Robert Maldonado from the Philosophy Department of California State University, Fresno, for the past 23 years. And half of those years, he's actually been with us at KNXT, sharing his scriptural expertise. Thank you, Robert, for another series. Our other guest, a special guest, is Reverend Dr. Breedlove, pastor of College Community Congregational Church here in Fresno. He's been on other programs with us on Luke, and we're so glad that he'll help us close down our study of this gospel. As we begin, I wonder if Robert could help us see the importance of chapter 24 in Luke. It's one of his favorite studies. His master's thesis was on this chapter. Could you tell us, Robert, why 24 is so important, and then walk us through those first verses that we're going to study?
Well, one of the interesting things about this chapter is I think Luke really sort of articulates what he thinks about how to present Jesus, and in particular the tradition and the interpretation of Scripture. And he does that mostly through the Emmaus story, and of course the Emmaus story is going to do a lot of other things, too. So here is that. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They went at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself in all the Scriptures."
It's one of your favorites. You did so much work with it. What are some of the elements that we may miss in a cursory read? What is the beginning of the depth of this, Robert?
Well, starting at the end, Moses and the prophets is a shorthand for the Bible, and even though it at times includes the Psalms as a sort of triple reference to the Bible, it doesn't have to. And of course, it was Moses and the prophets especially, and the Psalms, which become very important in early Christian interpretation of the life of Jesus and death of Jesus. One of the things that was most interesting to me when I was working on my master's thesis was that over and over Luke emphasizes, and I think I mentioned this before in one of the episodes, how the Scriptures predict that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and die. And of course it's very difficult to comb the Scriptures and find much that actually does anything like that. And so I think it really has more to do with, even though it says that, I think it has more to do with just a whole sort of orientation towards interpreting Scripture as they relate to not simply the life, death, and suffering of Christ, but of the whole teaching and life. And so one of the things I did was to take that and kind of look at how Luke was writing the infancy narratives. Many scholars think the infancy narratives are actually written perhaps last, and they're sort of a kind of mini whole gospel in themselves, and how John the Baptist and other sort of motifs are being caught up with Jesus and with Elijah and Samuel and being woven together to sort of promote the new dawn of this age, of the new age.
Chris, when you preach on this text, which I imagine comes up often enough in the lectionary, and many times you may have the chance, where do you go with your congregation?
Well, you look at the two disciples on the way to Emmaus. It's this almost mystical story that really captures the reading audience's imagination. And when you think about Cleopas and you think about the other disciple, they're at this point in the story, in the narrative, in the development of the narrative, they're kind of patrons of patron wanderers of this lost cause. That now, I guess we're going to go back to where we came from. What do we do now? Jesus, this experiment was an interesting try, but things didn't pan out the way we had hoped. We had put all of our lives into it. Now what do we do? And then this mystical encounter. The readers of this narrative, we are privy to who Jesus is, but this mystical sense of Jesus among the disciples, they don't recognize the disciples, and how often that is for people in the congregation, that everything we're going through, all of our valleys, all of our struggles, grim times, do we recognize God with us even in the valley?
One thing that I know Father Sergio Negro, in his homilies that he wrote, made a big point about showing how for Catholics it would be that this is almost the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. You have that journey in which the Scriptures are opened up, which for us would be that first reading, the Psalm, the second reading, and then there'd be the Gospel. But then finally, the Mass does not begin but continues in the breaking of the bread. So Luke almost in some way gives us a schematic of what is our own Christian Catholic liturgy.
And it's likely that early Christian practice is shaping the story itself, because Luke is writing some 55 or so years after the time of Jesus, and certainly the church is doing things. Right, they're commemorating the Eucharist. They're having some kind of meal ritual. We don't know all the particulars of how it was practiced, but it's not unreasonable to think that a number of these elements are actually embedded very early in the tradition. Another kind of interesting thing too is what Cleopas says is that we had hoped that he was a great prophet, mighty in deed and word, hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And of course what Jesus responds, incognito still, as Chris said, known to us, but not to them yet. And Jesus has not disclosed himself. In fact, he never sort of overtly does that. But he does berate them, and then he refers to all the prophets pointing to the Messiah and how necessary it was for him to suffer and die and rise. And so that's kind of code for us, right? For the people who know it's Jesus, who are listening, that he is, in a sense, both accepting that he is a prophet, but also that all the prophets don't include him, right? All the prophets point, all the prophets are waiting or expecting. So it's a kind of subtle move on Luke's part to sort of put it that way.
There is so much subtlety and so much nuance and so much irony and so much charm, so much care in the crafting of the narratives that we've seen with Luke over and over. No wasted word, but usually an image that sticks in your heart. Chris, would you like to lead us to the next part, which moves us to what happened after that?
As they came near the village of which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were open, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scripture to us?" The same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
What would be your initial first sharing on this, Pastor?
To Robert's point earlier, that it does appear that the practices of the church influencing the shaping and the writing and the redaction of the gospel narrative here. What drops into my line of view, looking at this, is the connection between when they broke bread, they recognized Jesus. Theologically, when we open the communion table, when we share the communion table, the recognition of God with us, that there is this theological practice here that is illustrating God with us.
Robert?
Several interesting things. First, that they are practicing hospitality, right? So they are urging Jesus to stay. And of course, it's easy to see his intention to go on as a sort of opportunity to see if they would, kind of thing. And so that is a kind of condition, I think, that Luke is setting up, that the hospitality is part of the table fellowship, both in Eucharist and in daily life, in almsgiving, in care. And also I've always been astonished by how unremarkable this story is in terms of how it's told, right? There's no kind of, they're impressed, but they don't seem to react when he disappears, right? I mean, as soon as they recognize him, he vanished from their sight. And that's not a point that's worth commenting on in the story, right? It's just a detail. Whereas I want to know more about what they were thinking and were they surprised by this, and what did they think it meant that he was this kind of thing that could simply disappear. Kind of person. I didn't mean thing per se. And the other thing that I find really interesting about this passage is there's a really great movie. I teach a course on Jesus and film, or Jesus films, and there's a very interesting film. I'd actually commend it if the viewers don't know it. It's called The Miracle Maker, and it's a stop-action kind of animation. Puppets that are kind of like claymation almost, but not actually claymation. And the main way that the movie is organized is there's a little girl who sort of is following Jesus along the way, and when he normally breaks bread in the movie, he lifts his hands and breaks the bread over his head, and characters comment about why does he do that, and other characters just say, well, that's just the way Jesus breaks the bread. And then at this story in the movie, she's there, the girl is there, and they don't know it's Jesus yet, but this character that they don't know who it is goes like this and breaks the bread over the head, and it's Jesus. And so it's a great moment in the film when and interestingly capturing the narrative here.
They told us we need to take our break, but please don't go far, because in 1 minute we'll be back and actually walk you through the last verses of this gospel that we have been sharing with you week after week. Stay tuned.
KNXT-TV is proud to say thank you to all its viewers who have given their support for over 25 years. And only through your support is KNXT able to provide spiritual and informative programming. Please remember KNXT in your long-term support through wills, bequests, trust, and plan giving. Your gift is important to the future of Catholic television. Help preserve the strength of KNXT's message based on the teachings of Christ. Keep KNXT in your future plans.
Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our final program, Breaking Open the Gospel of Luke. We'll be back next week with a wrap-up, but we are now looking at the last verses of this text. Robert, could you share with us the next passage about the appearances of the risen Christ in Jerusalem, at least the beginning of that text?
While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence.
Now we want to remind you, all the texts that we are reading today are Lucan only. What's important in this part, Robert, that you would really think we can't miss?
Well, first, maybe not even Lucan, because actually this passage has a number of phrases that are not quite clear that they're original to Luke. There's a suspicious similarity to John, which is very different from the Synoptic Gospels. Yeah. And it's possible that Luke and John can be using a similar source, but it's also possible that pieces of John may be cropping into the story as the Bible is being copied and recopied over and over again. So the piece with you and showing them his hands and his feet, it could simply be a kind of borrowing from John here. But one thing that I think is really important is that in the early church, one of the theologizing that was happening about Jesus was that he had no body. Yeah. That he was just a spirit. And this story may actually be part of a kind of counter-argument to that he's not simply a spirit, but has actual substance to him. And of course, it's not surprising that they would think he's a ghost. I mean, this guy vanishes, he just shows up, and so those are also traditions, and it's probably those kinds of traditions that helped contribute to that notion that he wasn't body. And then in the Creed, of course, emphasizing the bodily resurrection is also a response to that whole theologizing that was happening in the early church.
Pastor?
Historically, speaking to that point too, maybe an early form, a prototype of Gnosticism, this ideal, this distinction between the spiritual realm and the material realm or the physical realm, and where this becomes a problem for Christians as the history of Christianity advances, that eventually Christians that are influenced by Gnosticism, there is this temptation or this understanding that you can do whatever you want in the body realm, the material realm, because our soul, our spirit is sanctified, set apart, and there's this distinction that our soul, our spirit is okay, that's good, that's pure, everything goes for the body. And so one of the counterings might be looking back, the authorship of Luke, some of the authorship of Paul, trying to confront this early type of Gnosticism as Gnosticism is developing and growing, but to put a premium on the physicality of this person, Jesus, on the literal suffering and strife, that all that did happen, all that means something.
We have one more passage to read before the Ascension, and that would be our chance for Chris to share something and let us know how it is and why it is that this text is the last thing that Luke wants to record before the Ascension of the Lord.
Well, good. Let me read it and then we'll comment on it. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sin is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are my witnesses of these things. And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised, to stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Well, this is Luke's commission. This is the Great Commission that you find in Luke. It's different than Matthew, but it's very similar for the reader. Just a very base reading of the two Gospels there. You can tell that this is the commission that you find in Luke. But this is extended to all nations, all peoples. And that's very exciting. And from a preaching perspective, that kind of inclusion is very important in the gospel. This openness, this to all nations, all people, all times, all places. This very gracious invitation becomes very characteristic of the gospel that we preach and we teach and we hope for.
Robert, there seems to be so many motifs that we just looked at in another verbiage just before. He seems to repeat himself, as they say. What do you want to mention about any of that, about this necessity, about fulfillment, and all of that?
Well, the necessity is certainly just a major emphasis of Luke's. But I think what's here that's interesting is before he was explaining, he interprets the things about himself, and then here he opens their minds. And so it's sort of like content and then mechanism or method that they now have. So they now have the stuff that they need. And then the new thing that's particularly Lucan is that they are to be witnesses, that there is to be testimony that they have to give. And of course that requires some ability, if not just given by the Spirit, but here it seems to be because Jesus has explained and then opened their minds that they will, and then when the power from on high comes.
To make sure we're able to finish the full gospel, we've got those last 4 verses, which are Luke's presentation, which he'll express in a different way in Acts, but how does he do it in Luke there, Robert?
Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God.
How is that as a conclusion to the gospel compared to what we 1 year ago closed down Mark and had such a different understanding of the conclusion? Help us compare.
Well, the Gospels all end differently, and I think their endings are all quite good. Mark's, if you may remember, simply ends with the women being told to go tell, and they don't because they're afraid. And Matthew is the one that ends with Jesus remaining always to the close of the age. And then Luke is the only one who has the Ascension. And of course, he's going to repeat this again at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles with some slight additions. And then, of course, and the temple. So they stay in the temple. Blessing God. And that's something that many Christians don't know, is how important the temple was for much of early Christianity. The temple's only recently destroyed for Luke, 10, 15 years prior to Luke's writing. And up until that point, for I think most Christian sects or communities, the temple remained a very important spiritual symbol. It's only in the destruction of it that both Christianity and Judaism had to come to an understanding of how now do we continue with this thing gone. And I think Christians think that it was just gone with Jesus, but it actually, according to Luke and Paul both, the temple continues to be an important spiritual center for much of early Christianity, those decades.
Chris, any thoughts as we've just concluded the reading, final thoughts of yourself on this?
Well, the promise of Pentecost, the power, help will come to us at the appropriate time. When we first start hearing the story about it going to Emmaus, the disciples, the criticism there, I guess you could say, Jesus says, you're slow of heart, you're slow to understand, and that can be very disconcerting, and saying, gosh, I can be slow to faith, I can be slow to belief, I can be slow to comprehension, all of these things. But then as the reader certainly is brought into the story and has this knowledge all along, there is this assurance that even though we are prone to be slow of heart, we have help coming. We have illumination coming. The Spirit is coming, and this will be much clearer at that point.
It's so great that you mention that, Chris, because obviously we've only concluded with this, Book 1, Volume 1, Act 1, whatever. Luke definitely has the second act coming up with Acts of the Apostles. One liturgical note that might be interesting, maybe, we all know that with the Vatican Reform 50 years ago, we wound up having Matthew year 1, year A we call it, Mark year B, Luke year C. But then we also have the American Catholic bishops helping us prioritize certain things like the Ascension, and deciding that instead of celebrating it only on the 40th day after Easter, it becomes the Sunday in the sequence after Easter, so that at a Catholic liturgy we'll be reading this reading and celebrating as a community the Feast of the Ascension, which is really a big feast. It's a major thing. We've got about a minute for each of you so that you have a last chance to wrap up a loose end. Robert, what would you share?
Well, I would share one of the phrases I really like in this appearance in Jerusalem. So just a little bit back from where we are, when he shows them his hands and feet, maybe, and but he's there physically or whatever. What Luke says is, while in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, and then he gets the fish to eat. And I just like that phrase, that there's, that they're kind of hoping against hope. It's that, they've seen it, but they still, even though they're almost there, they're not quite there. And I just find it very much, real. That's often how some of the great, wonders and dramas of life, birth, death, just
and our personal lives
Yeah.
are not always so black and white. Chris, final thought.
The name of Cleopas stands out, but that name is specifically mentioned, and you become curious, well, what's the etymology of that name, Cleopas? Where does that come from? And it can mean, there's a few variable definitions, glory of the Father, or son of privilege, or a child of privilege, or a child of a distinct father. And so I wonder,
Nice.
just curiosity, wondering if this reveals who Luke is writing to. Some of these privileged Gentiles, that might be an audience there. But then when you look over the themes that the narrative of the Gospel of Luke is pointing out, lifting up the marginalized, the outcast, the Gentile, the poor, that becomes important to honor these groups, as it is all the way throughout the Hebrew Scriptures and the Old Testament collection. That becomes an important distinction, lifting up the marginalized. And I think here again, maybe Luke is writing to Cleopas, reminding his audience to reflect on
And
that.
next week, as we conclude this series, we'll look over all those major themes. We want to thank you. Till next week, God bless.